She walked into the upscale restaurant, certain the night would belong to her. Vic, always hungry for attention, spotted John, the quiet black waiter, whose uniform was smudged with the wear of a long shift hand, instantly decided he would be her entertainment. Smirking, she leaned back in her chair and began whispering insults in Japanese, calling him pathetic, laughing loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. She was confident, untouchable, amused by her own cruelty. But then John lifted his eyes, calm and steady, and responded to her in flawless, elegant Japanese. The room seemed to freeze around them. Vic's smile vanished, replaced by shock that tightened her throat. A black waiter speaking perfect Japanese? It didn't fit the world she thought she controlled, and the crack in that illusion terrified her. Still, she refused to back down. She kept provoking him, tossing sharper words, but the moment had already shifted. At the table beside her, a billionaire quietly set down his glass, his expression dark with disappointment. When John passed by again, the man stood, touched his shoulder gently, and asked to speak with him privately. Away from the noise, he slipped John a business card and said with a respectful bow, "Call me tomorrow morning." That single sentence would spark a partnership neither of them expected, and a plan that would change Vic's life forever. But before we go any further, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now let's discover how this story truly began. The upscale restaurant Le Summit shimmered with a golden glow that evening, as if every light had been polished to perfection just for the city's elite. Crystal chandeliers hummed softly above the dining room, catching reflections from marble floors and silver tableware. Conversations blended into a velvety background, noise-polished laughter, clinking glasses, the dull thrum of wealth pretending to be effortless. When Vic stepped through the entrance, the atmosphere shifted by a degree subtle, but perceptible to anyone who'd ever worked in hospitality long enough to sense trouble the moment it walked in. Her heels clicked like small declarations of superiority. Blonde hair curled in expensive waves around her shoulders, and her red dress clung to her like it had been designed solely to spotlight her presence. Her expression, however, was what people noticed first. Chin slightly lifted, eyes scanning the room as though everything she saw existed to disappoint her. The host approached with a polite smile, but she brushed past him with a flick of her manicured fingers. "I'll seat myself," she announced, as if granting the room a favor. She barely glanced at him, already walking toward her preferred Section 1 reserved for VIP clients who normally required a weeks-long reservation. Her friends followed behind her, already giggling, already whispering, already feeding off her energy. John saw her before she saw him. He recognized the type instantly, the posture, the careless entitlement that cast everyone else as background decoration. Even after a double shift, even with exhaustion tugging at the back of his spine, he still felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. But he forced a breath, pressed his shoulders back, and slipped into the polished calm he'd crafted over years of serving people who insisted on confusing luxury with virtue. He approached with menus in hand, offering the same warm smile he gave every guest, no matter how they looked at him. "Good evening," he said softly. Vic turned, eyes landing on him for barely a second before she pivoted toward her friends, her lips curving into a smirk sharp enough to draw blood. She looked him over from his shoes to the top of his head, not with curiosity, but with a cold, clinical dismissal, as though taking inventory of everything she believed made him beneath her. Then she switched languages. Her voice dropped into a falsely delicate tone as she spoke to her friends in Japanese, halting, poorly pronounced, but dripping with malicious confidence. "This place has lost its standards. A black waiter? How pathetic for a servant." Her friends choked on their laughter, stalked her mouth to hide her grin, but her eyes shone with triumph. She thought she was untouchable, cultured, invincible in her cruelty. John felt the words hit him like a physical blow, not because he hadn't heard worse, but because of how familiar that particular sting had become. He remembered the libraries in Tokyo he used to study in, long after midnight when the world was quiet enough to hold his loneliness. He remembered sitting on trains where people avoided the seat beside him. He remembered holding on to dignity when it felt like a fragile, trembling thing. He inhaled slowly, grounding himself, and instead of bowing his head or swallowing the insult, he looked her directly in the eyes and replied in flawless, elegant, Kyoto-accented Japanese, "I apologize if my presence offends you, madam, but true class is defined not by the language used to insult others, but by how we treat the people who serve us." Silence cracked across the table like a whip. Vic froze. Her fork hung halfway to her lips. The color drained from her face, then rushed back in an angry wave. A black waiter speaking Japanese, better at Japanese than she did, was something her worldview had not prepared her for. Her jaw clenched. "You!" She sputtered in English, louder now, drawing attention. "You threatened me!" John blinked, shocked by the accusation but unable to show it. He had learned long ago that reacting only made things worse. Her voice rose, trembling not from fear, but indignation at being corrected. "Where's the manager? I don't feel safe." He was rude, aggressive. Within seconds, the manager hurried over, apologizing to Vic before even asking what happened. John stood there, still as stone, watching the injustice unfold for the 1,000th time in 1,000 different forms. "I'll handle it, Vic," the manager assured her with a placating bow. "John, kitchen. Now." John nodded silently. His dignity felt scraped, bruised, but not broken. Not tonight. As he turned to leave, he noticed someone watching him from a nearby table-on older Asian man with calm, observant eyes. He wasn't gawking or pitying. He simply watched, as though cataloging every detail. Later, after the reprimand that felt more like a script the manager had learned by heart, John stepped back onto the dining floor. His heartbeat had steadied. His mask was back in place. The older man lifted a hand, signaling him over. When John leaned in, the man slipped a small black card into his hand. The lettering, gold, embossed, caught the light. "I heard what you said earlier," the man murmured in Japanese. "Your accent, Kyoto, very refined." John's breath stilled for a moment. The man smiled softly. "Integrity is rare, especially under fire. I may have a use for someone like you." Before John could respond, Vic strutted past, deliberately knocking a glass of wine to the floor. It shattered at his feet. "Oh, too bad," she said with a smirk. "Clean it up." He knelt, his hands shook slightly, not from humiliation, but from exhaustion, from restraint, from the aching desire for a life where people like her couldn't define him. The business card pressed into his pocket seemed to burn with meaning. He didn't know it yet, but that tiny piece of gold-stamped paper was the first crack in the world Vic believed she owned. John barely heard the clatter of pans and the hiss of steam in the kitchen. His manager's voice droned on, sharp and clipped, slicing through the humid air like a reprimand delivered on repeat. It wasn't the words that hurt, he'd grown used to those, but the certainty with which they were spoken. The certainty that he would accept them. That someone like him was expected to simply bow his head. "You can't speak to customers like that," the manager scolded, gesturing wildly as if he needed theatrics to fill in the absence of fairness, especially VIP clients. John's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression calm. He had learned long ago that silence was safer than truth. "I didn't speak to her disrespectfully," he whispered. "You corrected her," the manager snapped. "People like her don't like being corrected." John wanted to say that people like her didn't like seeing him as anything other than what they'd already decided he was, but the words lodged in his throat, heavy and useless. He needed the job. He needed the paycheck. He needed to help his mother after the hospital bills grew into something monstrous and unmanageable. So he bowed his head slightly. Yes, sir. The injustice burned. It rose in his chest like smoke, suffocating and bitter. But he swallowed it, just as he had swallowed so many things in his life. When he returned to the dining floor, he carried the exhaustion with him like a second uniform, invisible to everyone except himself. The chandeliers still glowed with golden perfection. The guests still laughed softly, untouched by the bruised dignity of the man delivering their plates. Then Mr. Tanaka looked up. The older man's gaze was gentle, steady in a way that didn't pry or pity. He lifted his hand slightly, requesting John's attention. John approached, unsure why the man wanted him. He braced himself for another complaint. Instead, the man slid something across the table. A small black card with gold lettering so elegant, it practically shimmered. "I heard what you said earlier," Mr. Tanaka said quietly, switching into Japanese as effortlessly as exhaling. "Your accent. It's from Kyoto, isn't it?" John blinked, stunned. Most people couldn't place nuances in Japanese accents, certainly not foreigners. But this man wasn't just anyone. "It is," John whispered. "I lived there for 3 years." Tanaka nodded as though the detail confirmed something important. "Refined. Precise. You speak it with respect." He leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "I've been looking for someone like that." John frowned gently. "For what?" "For a project requiring integrity," Tanaka said, lowering his voice, "and discretion. Fate has a way of balancing the scales, John." Before John could ask what that meant, movement behind him made his stomach tighten. Vic. She strutted toward the exit, her heels biting into the marble like small declarations of victory. She didn't look at him, not at first. Not until she passed right beside him. Then she swung her arm with practiced carelessness, knocking a half-full glass of wine from a nearby stand. It shattered at his feet. "Oh," she said, eyes bright with triumph. "Oops, clean it up." Her friends giggled as they left. John stared at the shards, jagged pieces glistening like fragments of something he hadn't even realized had broken inside him. He knelt slowly, gathering glass with his bare hands. The sting was faint, but the humiliation was sharp. Still, his dignity, though bruised, remained intact. In his pocket, the black card felt warm, almost alive against his palm. A reminder that the world wasn't only made of people like Vic. Some still saw him. Some still believed in him. The next morning, the city looked different. Colder, taller, hungrier. John stood at the base of a massive glass skyscraper, sleek, towering, impossible in its silent authority. He checked the address twice, then a third time. His reflection stared back at him from the mirrored exterior. Tired eyes, worn-out jacket, the faintest shadow of doubt. What was he doing here? Before he could retreat into uncertainty, a woman at the reception desk looked up and immediately gave a small bow. "Mr. Cole, please, follow me." He blinked. You were expecting me?" She only smiled and gestured for him to walk with her. The elevator ride was silent except for the soft hum of machinery lifting him higher and higher, past floors filled with people in immaculate suits, past offices where deals worth millions were probably being sealed with polished handshakes. His worn jacket suddenly felt like a spotlight aimed directly at his insecurities. When the elevator doors opened onto the penthouse level, it felt like stepping into another world, floor-to-ceiling windows, with views stretching across the city. Minimalist furniture crafted from dark woods and quiet luxury. An atmosphere that breathed generational wealth. Mr. Tanaka stood near a long table, pouring tea with deliberate calm. "I'm glad you came," he said, turning with a soft smile. "Please, sit." John lowered himself onto the chair carefully, as if afraid he might leave an imprint that didn't belong there. Tanaka filled a second cup and handed it to him with both hands. There was something intimate, almost ceremonial, about the gesture. John accepted it the same way. "I imagine," Tanaka began gently, That you're wondering why someone like me would seek out someone in your position. John nodded. Tanaka sat. My son, Kenji, is complicated, brilliant, but rebellious. He believes he can handle the world on his own. A shadow crossed his face. Lately, he's been influenced by the wrong people. John listened, hands wrapped around the warm porcelain. Vic, Tanaka said softly. The woman you met last night. Something inside John tightened. She has been presenting herself as a Japanese influencer, a cultured socialite with deep connections. But behind the curated persona, she's been manipulating my son to get closer to my company. My name. He paused. A family merger signing is scheduled soon. If that document is finalized, she gets access to an empire my ancestors spent generations building. John swallowed hard, unsure what this had to do with him. I need someone to show her true nature, Tanaka continued. Someone who doesn't fear her. Someone she already underestimated. John stared down at the tea, the reflection of the city rippling softly across the surface. I'm not a spy, he said. I'm just a man with integrity, Tanaka interrupted gently. A man who stood tall even when someone tried to break him down publicly. A man who understands dignity more than she ever will. Their eyes met. This isn't about revenge, John, Tanaka said, voice softening even further. It's about protecting my family and teaching someone that cruelty isn't a currency. Will you help me? For a long moment, John didn't breathe. He thought of last night, the humiliation, the injustice, the way he'd felt invisible and yet exposed at the same time. But when he remembered Tanaka's eyes, what he saw wasn't manipulation. It was hope. Quiet, steady, human. John exhaled slowly. I don't know if I'm the man you think I am, he whispered. Tanaka smiled. You are exactly the man I think you are. Something warm flickered in John's chest. For the first time in a very long time, he allowed himself to believe it. John said yes before he had fully understood the weight of the word. Yes to stepping into a life that was not his. Yes to confronting someone who had turned humiliation into a sport. Yes to protecting people he had never met simply because it felt like the right thing to do. And beneath all of it, quiet, steady, impossible to deny, was the deeper truth. He wanted to stop someone like Vic from hurting anyone else. Tanaka didn't waste a moment. From the second John agreed, the world seemed to move around him with a deliberate, inexorable force, as if fate was impatient to see what he would become. You will be Jonathan King, Tanaka said, senior consultant for the American expansion, calm, precise, a man who answers to no one but himself. The name felt foreign on John's tongue, heavy, almost regal. Jonathan King. A man built from steel and certainty, someone who didn't bow his head, didn't apologize for breathing, didn't shrink under cruelty. Why me? John whispered. Because, Tanaka said, she believes herself above you. People like her reveal their true nature when they think no one is watching. He placed a hand over John's shoulder, gentle but grounding. And you will be the one watching. The transformation began slowly, then all at once. The first fitting was unlike anything John had experienced. A private tailor, silent, exacting, dressed in charcoal grace, circled him with a measuring tape, murmuring numbers under his breath like a chant. Cool fingers pressed against John's shoulders to check posture. Fabric swatches brushed his jaw, light as whispers. You have a strong frame, the tailor remarked. Understated. We'll correct that. John didn't know how to respond. No one had ever evaluated him as someone worth presenting beautifully. The final suit arrived 3 days later. Italian wool, midnight black, sharp enough to rewrite a man's entire history. When John slipped the jacket over his shoulders, something shifted. The fabric hugged him in a way nothing ever had. Clean lines, deliberate structure, an architecture of confidence he didn't yet possess, but was being allowed to borrow. He stared at the mirror. The man looking back wasn't a tired waiter with grease stains clinging to his shirt and fatigue carved around his eyes. He wasn't the man who knelt to pick up broken glass while others laughed. He saw someone else entirely, educated, sharp, controlled. Someone who could walk into a boardroom without shrinking. Someone who could unnerve a woman like Vic with a single raised eyebrow. It frightened him, and it thrilled him. Tanaka observed him quietly from across the room. "Look at you," he said softly. "You were never small, John. The world simply tried very hard to convince you that you were." John swallowed hard. "What if I mess this up?" "You won't." Tanaka's gaze held warmth, not pressure. "You're not pretending to be intelligent, or capable, or worthy. You are those things. You're just finally dressed like it." The training came next. For hours each day, John sat with Tanaka's advisors, patient men and women in sleek suits, teaching him everything from corporate structure to international expansion strategy. It was overwhelming at first, a storm of terminology and acronyms and projections, but John adapted quickly. He memorized key company figures. He learned the American branch's goals. He studied the merger paperwork Vic so desperately wanted access to. He asked questions, careful, thoughtful, precise. Each night he went home exhausted, but it was a different kind of exhaustion. Not the draining kind that came from bending himself into smaller versions to fit other people's expectations. It was the exhaustion of expansion, of becoming someone more. Still, the part he feared most was not the business strategy. It was facing her. "You will need to be cold," Tanaka instructed. "Professional, unshakable." John took a slow breath. "I've never been intimidating." Tanaka smiled gently. "No, you've simply never been allowed to be." John rubbed his palms together. They were already sweating. "I'm worried I'll crack or stumble. What if my voice shakes? What if I look away too quickly?" "You don't need to act," Tanaka said. "Just show her the intelligence she refused to see." The words settled inside John like warm stones, solid, grounding, real. The day of the meeting arrived under a sky so clear it felt like a cruel joke, as if the universe wanted perfect visibility for what was about to unfold. John arrived early to the boardroom, a stunning space made of glass and steel, with a table long enough to seat 12 executives and still feel empty. The sunlight poured in, catching the high-polish finish of the floor, reflecting against the windows until the whole room glowed. He sat in the head chair, fingers pressed together, breathing slowly. He didn't have to pretend to be calm. He only had to hold still long enough for his nerves to quiet. 1 minute, 2, 5. His pulse leveled. He became Jonathan King. The door opened. Laughter floated in before the people did sharp, tinkling, artificial. Vic walked in wearing a white designer dress that hugged her curves with calculated precision. Every piece of her look screamed confidence, dominion, entitlement. On her arm was Kenji Handsome, distracted, oblivious to the storm he was walking into. Vic surveyed the room with a smirk. "Where's the consultant?" she asked the assistant sharply. "I don't have all day." "The consultant," the assistant said politely, "is already here." Vic frowned and turned, just as the chair at the head of the table began to swivel. John rotated slowly, every movement controlled, quiet, deliberate. His posture perfect, his gaze steady, his suit a second skin. Her expression changed in a single breath. Recognition struck first, then disbelief. Then something colder, something close to fear. John didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, without a single word, without raising his voice or even lifting his chin, he made her realize the truth she had never allowed herself to consider. She was no longer the one with power. Vic stared at the man seated at the head of the polished mahogany table, her eyes narrowing as though her vision were deceiving her. The suit he wore was immaculate, charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, expensive in a way she recognized immediately. His posture was effortless, composed, the kind of stillness that only came from someone accustomed to being listened to. But it was his face that made her heart stutter. Something about him, a shadow of a memory, tugged at the edge of her mind. She blinked rapidly, trying to dispel the thought. The man turned the chair fully toward her. His expression was calm, unreadable, his gaze level and firm. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a depth she did not expect, smooth, confident, with a timbre that settled into the walls like it owned them. "Good afternoon," he said. "I am Mr. King." The words were simple, yet they hit Vic with a strange kind of force. A whisper of recognition coiled up her spine, uninvited and unwelcome. That voice, that deliberate softness, that steady confidence. She had heard it once before, or at least she believed she had. But that was impossible. A man like him wasn't someone she would forget. She inched closer to Kenji, her polished nails pressing faintly into his sleeve. "He looks like the staff from the restaurant," she murmured in a tight whisper. Kenji arched an eyebrow, perplexed. He hadn't been there for that humiliating dinner scene, nor had he ever laid eyes on John while he was in his work attire. "I don't know who you're talking about," he murmured back, shrugging off her comment. His eyes remained fixed on Mr. King, clearly intrigued by the man's presence. John heard her. Of course he did. The room was silent enough that even a breath felt audible. But he didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't let the remark graze the surface of his professionalism. Instead, he lifted the folder before him and opened it with deliberate precision, as though ready to dissect her entire world with nothing but paper, ink, and the truth she had avoided for far too long. "We will begin," he said simply. His tone left no room for protest. Vic straightened, clearing her throat. She tried to regain her usual confidence, but something in her chest fluttered uncomfortably. It felt like standing under a light far too bright, revealing things she didn't want exposed. Her palms dampened as she folded them neatly in her lap, trying to mimic composure. John dove into the questions with a sharp, focused intensity. He dissected her proposal line by line, each inquiry more precise, more incisive, more revealing of her lack of preparation. He wasn't cruel. He didn't raise his voice or sneer or belittle her. That almost made it worse. His calmness was the scalpel. His professionalism was the blade. "You stated in your preliminary outline that your network of contacts includes regional investors in Osaka," John said, eyes locked on hers. "Which firms specifically?" Vic's throat tightened. "Well, I work with many, so there isn't just one." "That is not an answer," John replied softly, but the softness only accentuated the blow. "If you intend to proceed with a merger of this magnitude, ambiguity is not an option." She felt heat crawling up her neck, an unwelcome flush. She tried to smile, but even she could feel the cracks in it. John turned to Kenji then, seamlessly shifting languages as though switching gears in a machine he had mastered long ago. His Japanese came out fluid, elegant, effortless. "Kenji-san," he said, "watashi wa anata no aikano o kikitai. Kono pura pazaru ni, dono tabeki ga hitseo, dato omoimasu ka." "Kenji, I would like your opinion. What guidance do you think this proposal still needs?" Kenji responded immediately, his shoulders relaxing in relief at being addressed in his native language. They exchanged a few sentences, quick, nuanced, the kind of conversation filled with cultural implications and subtle undertones. Vic tried to follow, but her limited vocabulary failed her. Their words moved too quickly, elegantly skipping along terrain she had never managed to fully grasp. She felt small, excluded, like a child watching adults discuss something beyond her reach. Her chest tightened with an unfamiliar sensation, panic. It pulsed low and sharp beneath her ribs, spreading through her like an unwelcome wave. For the first time in a long time, she was not the most powerful person in the room. She wasn't even close. When John returned to English, his tone remained steady, but now carried an unmistakable edge. "Miss Vick, the structure of your sponsorship model shows inconsistencies. Would you care to explain the discrepancy in projected revenue between your initial pitch and your revised figures?" Her breath caught. There was a discrepancy. She hadn't thought anyone would look closely enough to notice. She forced a smile that felt like glass cracking in her mouth. "It was an oversight," she said. "Minor adjustments, nothing significant." John's gaze remained unreadable. Significance is measured by those affected, not those responsible. She swallowed. Every question, every correction, every quiet pause that made her confront her own uncertainty, it all stripped away layers she had always hidden behind. She had never realized how fragile her composure truly was until someone challenged it without fear, without intimidation, without bending under her social weight. Desperate, she reached for a lifeline. "Mr. King," she said, injecting every ounce of charm she could muster into her voice, "I'm hosting a private gala this weekend. Influential partners, investors, international guests. It would be an honor to have you attend. Perhaps, outside this formal setting, I can demonstrate the value I bring to the Tanaka family." John lifted his gaze from the documents slowly, very slowly, meeting her eyes with startling clarity. A thin smile touched his lips. Not warm, not mocking, but calculated. "I look forward to seeing your true character on display, Miss Vick." Vick felt her heart lurch. Something in his tone cut deeper than any criticism he had offered. It felt like a warning, a signal of something inevitable and approaching. She forced herself to thank him, forced herself to stand with poise, forced herself to leave the room with the illusion of control. But the moment she stepped past the threshold, her knees weakened. She didn't know what trap she had walked into, but every instinct screamed that one existed. She just didn't yet understand who had said it, or why the man at the head of the table had eyes that saw straight through her. The gala shimmered like a jewel against the night sky, its glass walls radiating golden light that spilled across the estate lawn in warm, shimmering waves. It was the kind of event designed to impress the kind the city's elite attended, not because they cared, but because their absence would be noticed. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, the air filled with the low hum of expensive engines and the staccato rhythm of camera shutters capturing designer gowns and tailored suits. Inside, champagne flowed like liquid gold. A string quartet played gentle arpeggios from the corner balcony, and the guests drifted through the grand hall like opulent ghosts. John arrived in a sleek black limousine. When the driver opened the door for him, the entire atmosphere seemed to shift almost imperceptibly, as though the room recognized the arrival of someone significant. He stepped onto the marble entrance wearing a perfectly fitted tuxedo, classic, understated, elegant. There was nothing ostentatious about it, but the simplicity only amplified his presence. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that was more commanding than any wealth or status displayed around him. He was the guest of honor tonight, not because the world knew his name, but because the people in the room needed him more than they realized. As he walked past the chandelier's cascading light, he felt something inside him settle, not pride, not revenge, but a strange calm, a sense of purpose. He may have been playing a role tonight, but every step reminded him how far he had come from the night at the restaurant, wiping wine off polished floors, while people like Vic laughed at him. He moved through the crowd with a steady, observant gaze. He didn't mingle unnecessarily, didn't seek attention. Instead, he watched quietly, carefully catching details others overlooked. That's when he saw her. Vic floated through the room like she owned it, dressed in a gown of shimmering silver, hair curled into perfect waves, chin raised with practiced poise. Beside her hung a smile that never reached her eyes, a smile sharpened by entitlement rather than joy. She flitted between tables, offering compliments that sounded like thinly veiled criticisms, laughing too loudly, touching arms and shoulders as if staking claim over the entire event. But it wasn't her beauty or presence John watched. It was the tiny fractures in her mask, the moments when her eyes hardened, when her smile vanished between breaths, when she snapped at a server who didn't move quickly enough or frowned at a guest who didn't address her with sufficient reverence. And then there was the moment that crystallized everything. A young maid, no older than 19, dropped a folded napkin onto the floor near the dessert table. It was a simple mistake, the kind anyone could make. Her hands trembled as she stooped to pick it up, clearly mortified in front of such extravagant guests. Vic swooped in instantly. "For God's sake," she hissed under her breath, loud enough for John to hear from across the hall. "You people have one job. How incompetent can you be?" The girl froze, eyes widening with humiliation. She bowed her head, murmuring an apology so soft it was practically a breath. Vic rolled her eyes, spun on her heel, and walked away without waiting for a response. It was all John needed. The restaurant incident had not been a slip of temper. It was not a bad day. This casual cruelty was her nature. John approached the maid gently. She was wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her uniform, trying to hide in the shadow of a towering floral arrangement. "Miss," he said softly. She startled, quickly standing up straighter. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to. You don't need to apologize," he said, voice warm, steady. "Not to me, and not to her." He handed her a crisp white handkerchief embroidered with the initials JK. She hesitated, staring at it as though it were too kind a gesture to accept. "Everyone makes mistakes," he whispered. "But the right people see effort, not failure. Don't let someone else's cruelty define your worth." Her throat tightened. She nodded, pressing the handkerchief to her face. "Thank you," she whispered. Across the hall, Vic's eyes locked onto them. Her expression twisted confusion, suspicion, irritation, all tangled together. She stormed toward them, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Why?" she demanded, her voice strained with false sweetness. "Are you talking to the staff, Mr. King?" John slowly turned to face her. He didn't glare, didn't challenge. He simply looked at her with the calm of someone who already knew the truth. "A leader who cannot respect the foundation of their house," he said in a quiet, deliberate tone, "will eventually see it collapse." Vic scoffed, folding her arms tightly across her chest. "Please." Compassion is good for charity campaigns, but in business? It makes you weak. Too soft. John held her gaze for a long moment. There was nothing soft in his eyes. "If softness means seeing people as human," he replied, "then I have no desire to be whatever you call strength." She opened her mouth to reply, but no sound came out. Her indignation simmered behind her eyes, molten and unstable. She turned on her heel and walked away, the tension in her shoulders betraying the fear she refused to acknowledge. Later, after the music swelled into another delicate arrangement, and the conversations around the hall blended into a low hum, John stepped outside onto the balcony. The night air was cool, crisp, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the garden below. The city lights glittered in the distance, a constellation woven across the skyline. Kenji stood alone near the railing, shoulders hunched slightly forward, hands clasped together. He looked younger in that moment, less polished, less sure of himself than he seemed inside. John approached him quietly. "Kenji-san," he said gently. Kenji looked up. There was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, as though he already sensed something was wrong, but wasn't ready to name it. John inhaled slowly. This part wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about truth delivered with enough care that it didn't break the person receiving it. "I need to speak to you," John said, "not as a consultant, not as Mr. King, just as one man to another." Kenji's jaw tightened. "Is this about Vic?" "Yes." Kenji looked away, staring at the city lights. My father sent you to turn me against her. No, John said softly. He sent me to protect you. What you choose to do with what I show you is entirely yours. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim folder, Tanaka's investigative file. He held it out. Kenji hesitated before taking it. John stepped back, giving him space. Kenji opened the folder. The first page hit him like a physical blow. Screenshots, time-stamped messages, threads of conversations where Vic mocked him, mocked his heritage, mocked his father, mocked the culture Kenji held deeply, privately sacred. She used him like a key to open the doors she wanted. Kenji's hand trembled. He turned the page. More proof, more manipulation, more cruelty disguised behind emojis and shallow compliments to her friends. His chest tightened, breath catching somewhere between disbelief and heartbreak. She? He whispered, voice cracking. She said these things about me? John nodded. I'm sorry. Kenji gripped the railing, knuckles whitening. He closed his eyes tightly as though trying to hold himself together. My father was right, he murmured. I didn't want to believe him. I thought he couldn't understand her. I thought she saw me, but the only thing she saw was an opportunity. John stood beside him, not close enough to crowd him, but near enough that Kenji didn't feel alone. Pain doesn't disappear just because we refuse to look at it, John said, but facing it gives us the chance to choose better. Kenji swallowed hard, blinking back burning tears. I don't know what to do. You don't need to decide tonight, John said gently. Just don't let her define your worth. You are more than the image she painted. Kenji exhaled shakily. Thank you, he whispered. It was small, fragile, but sincere. The first time that night, John felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Not for revenge, but for healing. For Kenji. And maybe, in some quiet corner of his heart, for himself too. The city glowed beneath the fading evening light, its skyline etched against a violet horizon. Somewhere beyond the glass towers and distant highways, the world continued in its noisy, indifferent rush. But inside John's apartment, time felt strangely suspended, as if the air itself had thickened around him. Tomorrow would decide everything. The signing ceremony, the culmination of weeks of manipulation, careful observation, painful truths. The final act in a play he never wanted to star in, but stepped into, because someone had to stop the damage Vic left in her wake. Across the city, Vic was celebrating. She believed she had already won. Her social media buzzed with filtered photos, smug captions, and triumphant winks at her followers. Breaking boundaries, expanding west to east, taking over the Asian market. She posed with champagne, designer dresses, and the same hollow smile she'd worn at the gala, bright enough to fool the world, but not bright enough to fool a man who had seen her stripped of her armor. John closed his eyes, letting out a long, weary exhale. He sat on the edge of his small apartment bed, an ordinary place with peeling paint, a bookshelf half filled with used novels, and a window overlooking a quiet alley. It was a stark contrast to the wealth he could easily afford, but chose not to flaunt. He liked living simply. It reminded him of who he was before the world learned his name. On the nightstand sat a battered wooden frame. Inside it, the faded picture of a woman with gentle eyes and a tired smile. His mother watched him with the same quiet patience she had carried through life. He lifted the frame, feeling the tenderness of memory rise in his chest. "Mom," he whispered, thumb brushing the glass, "I don't know if this is justice or cruelty." The lines of her face softened something inside him, her resilience, her warmth, her insistence that kindness was strength even when the world spat on it. She had shown him how to rise, how to rebuild, how to respond to cruelty without becoming cruel. He swallowed hard. "This isn't just about her," he murmured, voice cracking slightly. "It's about preventing her from hurting more people. It's about stopping the cycle." He placed the frame back on the nightstand, shoulders trembling with a heaviness he didn't show anyone, not even Tanaka. As if summoned by the thought, his phone vibrated. "Tanaka said," he answered. On the other end, Tanaka's deep, steady voice resonated with the calm of someone who had orchestrated enough corporate battles to sense when a storm was about to break. "Are you ready for the final act?" Tanaka asked. John stared at the far wall, where the last rays of sunset painted streaks of gold and rose. "I don't enjoy this," John admitted quietly. "Not even with someone like her. Humiliation can destroy a person if it's done recklessly." "This is not to destroy her," Tanaka said. "This is to open her eyes. You said it yourself." John nodded slowly, even though Tanaka couldn't see it. "She needs to understand what humiliation feels like, not to break her, but to wake her up." There was a brief silence on the line. Then Tanaka responded, "And that is why we chose you." The next evening, the atmosphere at the venue pulsed with wealth and anticipation. Spotlights illuminated tall banners printed with Vic's face. The words "Global Expansion Summit" emblazoned in metallic lettering beneath her smiling portrait. Crystal chandeliers glimmered overhead, casting sparks of light across polished marble floors and rows of pearl-white chairs. Dozens of influential guests filled the space: investors, executives, media representatives, each wearing the expectant expression of someone about to witness a major announcement. On stage, Vic stood centered beneath a sweeping arch of lights, microphone in hand, radiating confidence. Her silver dress shimmered like liquid mercury, her lips curved into a triumphant smile. She looked invincible, and she genuinely believed she was. "Tonight," she announced into the microphone, her voice poised and resonant, "we celebrate a new beginning, one that bridges continents, cultures, and opportunities." The audience applauded. Cameras flashed. Vic's eyes drifted to the front row, and there he was, John. She winked at him, with the smug delight of someone certain she had fooled the one person who mattered most in the room. She had no idea. When the applause quieted, she gestured toward him, inviting him onto the stage with a graceful flick of her hand. "And now," she said, "the man who believed in me from the very beginning, Mr. King." John rose slowly. The air shifted around him, a whisper of tension rippling through the crowd as he made his way toward the stage. Every step echoed with something steady, deliberate, not anger, not triumph, purpose. Vic handed him the microphone with a bright smile, expecting praise, validation, a public display of her supposed brilliance. Instead, John faced the audience, his expression calm but resolute, and switched seamlessly into Japanese. The audience leaned forward. Murmurs spread. Some translators scrambled to catch his words. John spoke clearly, each syllable sharp as glass. "Miss Vic believes she has purchased our culture," he said. A hush fell. He paused, then shifted into English, not for the audience, but for her. But unfortunately, currency cannot buy character. The room erupted into a low, confused rumble. Heads turned. Voices whispered. The investors at the back stood up slightly, trying to see what was happening. Vic's smile collapsed in on itself, like a building losing its foundation. Her throat tightened. Her fingers twitched against her dress. She forced a laugh, strained and brittle. "What are you doing?" she hissed under her breath, leaning toward him, but her voice wasn't confident anymore. It shook, and she knew far too late that she had stepped directly into the trap she thought she had laid for him. John didn't raise his voice, yet somehow it carried across the ballroom with a weight that felt older than all of them, older than pride, older than cruelty. It carried like a truth that had been held too long behind clenched teeth. 3 days ago," he said, each syllable slow, unwavering, "this woman told a waiter he was pathetic because of the color of his skin." His gaze did not harden. If anything, it softened, weighted with memory, not anger. She didn't know that the waiter was me. For a moment, the room didn't breathe. It was as if every person present felt something in their chest shift: recognition, shock, shame, confusion. A gasp traveled through the audience like a cold breeze, brushing over silk gowns and freshly pressed suits, leaving a faint sting in its wake. Vic's face drained instantly, the flush of performance replaced by a waxy, trembling whiteness. Her lips parted, then twisted, contorting into a desperate snarl. "You lie!" The words ripped out of her throat, raw and panicked. "You're a consultant! You're Mr. King!" Her voice cracked as she pointed at him, her hands shaking with the kind of fear that came not from guilt, but from losing control. "This is some stunt! You're trying to ruin me!" John didn't flinch. He looked at her the way someone might look at a storm from behind reinforced glass, sadly, patiently, knowing it was impossible to fight wind with words. "I am John," he said quietly, and the stillness that followed felt like the world exhaling. "Not Mr. King, not the persona you believed you could manipulate. I am a waiter. I am also a scholar. And I am the man advising Mr. Tanaka not to sign this contract." There was no cruelty in the way he said it, no triumph, just truth, clean, unvarnished truth. Vic lunged for the microphone, her movements jerky, almost childlike in their desperation. But before her hand reached it, the massive LED screens behind her flickered. Lines of static shivered across the display like an electrical tremor. Then the footage began. The restaurant, the deep amber glow of Le Summit, the quiet hum of dinner service. And her, crystal clear, her face pinched with superiority, her laughter sharp, mocking, tinged with venom, her voice unmistakable, dripping with disdain as she tore into a waiter who stood bowed, humiliated. The audio was painfully crisp. It echoed through the ballroom with a violence that didn't need shouting. It was the violence of words, of tone, of 1,000 casual cruelties wrapped into a single moment she never imagined would follow her. People watched her, not the woman she wanted them to see, not the glamorous deal-maker she pretended to be, but the truth of her. Her investors stiffened. Journalists leaned forward. And friends, those who had praised her, envied her, tolerated her, shifted uncomfortably, shrinking away as though proximity to her might stain them. "No, no, turn it off," Vic cried out, her voice dissolving into broken pitches. "This is illegal. This is twisted. Someone stop it." She spun around looking for help, for someone, anyone willing to intervene on her behalf. And then she found Kenji. He stepped forward from the shadows near the side entrance, tall, poised, wearing a tailored suit that made him look even more like the heir the world expected him to be. But it was his face that silenced her. Not angry, not vindictive, just devastated. He approached slowly, each step deliberate, as though approaching something fragile, not her, but whatever illusion he'd once held of her. "Kenji," she whispered, voice cracking. She tried to smile through the panic. "You know me. You know I would never, this is taken out of context." He stopped beside his father, the weight of lineage settling across his shoulders, and shook his head once. The gesture was so small, yet it shattered her. "I looked up to you," he said softly, not cruelly. His voice carried the quiet disappointment of someone who had believed in something that never existed. "I defended you. I thought people misunderstood your confidence for ambition." His eyes lifted to the screen behind her, where the footage looped. Her laughter filled the room again. "But now, I understand they were right." Vic's breath hitched. She reached out as if to touch him, but he took half a step back, barely noticeable, yet devastatingly clear. "Kenji, please," she begged. "You can't believe this defines me. It was stressed. I didn't mean everyone says things they don't." His gaze flicked to John, then returned to her. "This isn't stress," Kenji said gently. "This is who you are when you think no one is watching." She froze. Her hands dropped to her sides, fingers trembling violently. For the first time, there was no defiance left in her. No performance, no social mask. Just a woman standing in the ruins of her own making. The audience wasn't cheering. They weren't gloating. They simply watched her unravel, the same way people watch something fragile fall apart quietly, with a mix of discomfort and inevitability. Mr. Tanaka placed a hand on his son's shoulder before turning to Vic with a calm solemnity. Humiliation, he said, is not a tool we use lightly. His eyes soft, not with pity, but with something older, a warning wrapped in mercy. But a mirror, when held correctly, can still save the one reflected in it. Vic's chin wobbled. She looked like she wanted to argue, scream, fight. But the words died in her throat. There was nothing left to hide behind, nowhere to run, nothing to twist into a prettier shape. Just truth, unfiltered and undeniable. And in that truth, she looked terribly small. John watched her quietly, not with triumph, but with something closer to sorrow, because he had never wanted to destroy her. He had only wanted her to see herself clearly, to understand the pain she had inflicted so easily on others. Lessons learned too late still change lives. And this moment, this raw exposure, was the beginning of hers. Vic's breath came in short, frantic bursts as the footage looped again behind her. Every second felt like another thread snapping loose from the tapestry she had woven so carefully around herself. She tried to hold it together, her smile shaky, her eyes darting from face to face as though searching for one single ally who might still pretend not to see. Then she grasped the only lifeline she thought she had left. "It's a deep fake," she shouted, raising her voice over the murmurs that surged through the ballroom. "This is fabricated. They're trying to sabotage me." Her finger shot toward the screens as if pointing at them could unmake what they revealed. "You all know how advanced this technology is. This isn't real." Her voice cracked sharply, the pitch slicing through the room like broken glass. But the lie didn't land. "Not this time." The crowd's reaction wasn't confusion, it was something closer to a collective recoil. Her investors exchanged uneasy glances. Journalists whispered behind raised hands. A few once loyal friends tightened their lips and looked away. And some, those who had tolerated her cruelty in private spaces, excused her sharp humor, let her slide, now took the easiest path. They turned their backs, literally. A small pocket of guests pivoted their bodies away from her, a gesture so subtle and so devastating that Vic froze mid-plea. The message was unmistakable. "We won't defend you. We won't stand beside you. You did this." A low boo rose from somewhere deep in the room. It wasn't loud, not angry, just disappointed, like a community mourning something it had long suspected but hoped wasn't true. Others joined in hesitantly at first, then with growing certainty. They flinched at each sound, the way a person might flinch from unexpected shrapnel jerking. Blinking rapidly, her confidence collapsing in on itself. "No, stop, you don't understand," she cried, but her voice only seemed to make the crowd more uneasy. "They're lying. He's lying." Her gaze shot toward John like a blade, sharp and trembling. But before she could launch another accusation, a calm voice cut through the chaos. Mr. Tanaka stepped forward. The room quieted instantly. He carried himself with the stillness of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to fear. It was a kind of quiet authority that demanded attention without ever raising its volume. "My son showed me your messages, Victoria," he said, his tone neither cruel nor kind, just impossibly steady. His eyes lowered, not in shame, but in disappointment so heavy it almost bent the air around them. "You called our traditions, costumes, and my son a ticket to the bank." A murmur of shock rippled across the room. Even those who suspected her prejudice had not expected such unfiltered contempt. Mr. Tanaka's final words fell like soft thunder. "The deal is terminated." It was not a dramatic declaration. It was simply final, like a door closing gently but decisively, with no intention of reopening. There was a sound from Vika, small, strangled gasps, so human, so raw, that for a brief second even John felt something inside him shift. Her shoulders slumped. Her arms fell limply to her sides. The light she had used to dazzle and manipulate dimmed all at once, leaving her stripped of the persona she cherished so fiercely. She looked at John, tears brimming and spilling in uneven streaks down her cheeks. But they weren't tears of remorse, only rage, fear, disbelief. All the emotions that erupt when a person realizes they can no longer control the narrative of their own wrongdoing. "You ruined everything!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a near sob. "You're nothing. You're just a nobody." The insult should have stung. In another life, another moment, maybe it would have. But John stood still, shoulders relaxed, face calm, not indifferent, but grounded. The same calm dignity he had held that night in the restaurant returned now like an old friend. "I am a human being," he said softly, but every person in the room heard it. "That is something you clearly forgot how to be." The truth of it seemed to slice through whatever was left of her composure. Security approached from the side, not rough, not aggressive, just firm, guiding her toward the steps. Flashbulbs erupted instantly. Reporters leaned forward, cameras raised high as they documented every staggered movement of her downfall. She didn't walk off stage. She was ushered, almost lifted by the guards as her trembling legs failed to carry her. And though the lights were bright and the crowd was vast, she looked utterly alone. Completely and devastatingly alone. Her humiliation wasn't because of her race, not because of her class, not because of her wealth. It was because of her choices laid bare, undeniable, reflected back at her with painful clarity. The press captured each moment of her collapse, the tear-streaked makeup, the wild confusion in her eyes, the desperate attempts to erase what she could no longer hide. And for the first time, the world saw her not as a socialite, nor an influencer, nor a rising star of international business. They saw her as who she had always been beneath the shine. John stood where he was while the room slowly emptied around him. People whispered on their way out, some shaken, some contemplative, some still processing the truth of what they had witnessed. When the last of the guests had trickled out and the murmurs faded behind the grand doors, a heavy silence settled over the hall, not uncomfortable, just honest. It felt strange to him, this mix of exhaustion and release. His body was tired, the kind of tired that lives in the bones, not the muscles. Yet inside his chest, there was something lighter than air, something he hadn't felt in days. Peace, not triumph, not satisfaction, just a quiet, humble peace. The truth had been spoken, exposed, set free. The silence around him wasn't empty, it carried the weight of everything that had finally been allowed to surface. John exhaled slowly, letting the tension unwind from his shoulders, letting the truth settle around him like a blanket after a long winter. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the first stirrings of something faint but unmistakable. Healing. The world did not simply turn against Vikit, recoiled from her as though waking from a long sleep and finally recognizing the danger in its midst. Within hours of the gala, the video was everywhere. Millions of views, tens of thousands of comments. Her name trended for all the wrong reasons. No longer the glamorous socialite who curated luxury like a second skin, but a symbol of cruelty caught under the harshest, most unforgiving light. Her sponsors dropped her within a day. Her PR team released a statement so quickly it was almost comedic, an attempt at damage control that fooled no one. The comments beneath her posts turned into a tidal wave of backlash, the kind she used to mock when it happened to others. Now it was her turn to feel the sting. In the days that followed, the fallout was merciless. Her investors pulled out. Her invitations vanished. Her social circle evaporated. Within a week, she was forced to sell her car, then her jewelry, then pieces of art she once bragged about owning. The gala she had planned as the crowning moment of her triumph had left her drowning in unpaid bills. And with no reputation left to negotiate, She sold off what remained of her curated life. John watched it all unfold from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet heaviness. There had been enough destruction, enough humiliation. What mattered now was what could come after. Exactly 1 week after the gala, John arrived at the Tanaka offices for a meeting he knew would shape his future, though he wasn't sure how. The building felt different now, less intimidating, more familiar, like a place he had earned the right to stand in. Kenji was there waiting for him in the conference room, his hands clasped in front of him. When John entered, Kenji bowed, not a shallow, polite nod, but a deep, grateful bow from the waist. The kind reserved for someone who has saved you from a fate you didn't know you were walking toward. "Thank you," Kenji said quietly as he rose. "Not for exposing her. That was painful, but necessary. I thank you for saving me from a marriage that would have hollowed me out." His voice wavered slightly, the vulnerability in it stark, honest, human. "I would have spent my life trying to earn affection from someone who never intended to give it." John placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't deserve that, Kenji." Kenji's smile was small but genuine, the kind that only appears after a great weight has been lifted. Then Mr. Tanaka entered the room carrying a leather folder the color of mahogany. As he sat, he slid a crisp sheet of paper across the polished table toward John. The contract inside was thick, official, unmistakably real. "You played the role of an executive perfectly, John," Tanaka said, folding his hands together. "You demonstrated intelligence, composure, ethics, and leadership. This offer is not symbolic. It is a real position, real salary, a company car, travel opportunities, a team under you." He paused, letting the gravity settle. "Respect, stability, a future on a path that men strive decades to reach." John stared at the contract. His name was printed at the top in bold, elegant letters. It was everything he had once dreamed of. No more late nights washing dishes. No more worrying if the rent would clear. No more customers who looked at him and saw only the color of his skin or the grease on his clothes. This job offered dignity without having to fight for it every day. John picked up the pen, feeling the weight of metal between his fingers. His hand hovered over the signature line. His heartbeat thudded slowly, deeply, filling his chest with a clarity he couldn't ignore. He thought about the kids from his neighborhood, the ones who were smart, talented, bursting with potential, but convinced the world was wired against him. Kids who believed that people like John were anomalies, exceptions to the rule, flukes of luck rather than proof that brilliance lived everywhere. He thought of himself at 16, sitting on the edge of his bed, wondering if effort mattered in a world that already seemed to have decided who he was. The pen trembled slightly in his hand. Then he set it down. "I can't take this job, Mr. Tanaka. Not like this." Tanaka blinked, caught genuinely off guard. "You refuse?" His voice wasn't angry, just surprised, maybe even confused. "May I ask why?" John exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. "Because if I disappear into a corporate office after everything that happened, then all I've done is save myself." Kenji looked at him with wide eyes, and even Tanaka leaned in, listening more closely. John continued, his voice soft but firm, the kind that carried truth born from lived experience. "There are kids where I live who think studying is pointless. Kids who think no matter how hard they try, no one's going to open a door for them unless they already have money or power." He swallowed, suddenly aware of the emotion clawing at his throat. "If I just accept this role and vanish into the executive floor, I leave them behind. I leave behind every kid who never met someone who looked like them, sitting at a table like this." He looked at the contract again, then met Tanaka's eyes. "I want to do something else with your investment." Silence wrapped around the room for a long moment, not tense, but thoughtful. Tanaka's expression shifted, first confusion, then curiosity, then something deeper, like respect beginning to take root. "What is it you have in mind?" Tanaka asked quietly. John inhaled deeply, steadying the words forming inside him. Something that doesn't just change my life, he said. Something that changes lives. 6 months later, the city center felt different, brighter, somehow, as if a new pulse had been woven into its streets. There had once been an abandoned warehouse with boarded windows and graffiti that had long lost its color. Now stood a building of glass and warm wood, its large windows catching the sunlight and scattering it in soft gold across the sidewalk. On the front, in carefully carved letters, the name shone like a promise. The Bridge Cultural Center. A crowd had gathered for the opening, forming a semicircle near the entrance. Children in slightly oversized shirts leaned against their parents. Teenagers wearing backpacks stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes sharp with curiosity. Elders watched from the back with quiet pride. Journalists hovered around the edges, their cameras ready, though their presence felt secondary to the sense of community that filled the air. John stood at the front, holding a pair of ceremonial scissors. He wore a simple charcoal suit, not flashy, not expensive, but dignified, comfortable, his own. His hands were steady now in a way they hadn't been 6 months ago. Not because he was unafraid, but because he had finally understood the purpose of his voice. To his left stood Mr. Tanaka, his posture elegant and composed. To his right stood Kenji, smiling with the gentle sincerity that had become his trademark. Behind them, a group of students waited enthusiastically, already clutching notebooks and pencils even though classes hadn't officially begun. As John lifted the scissors, the murmur of the crowd softened to a hush. For the first time in his life, he wasn't stepping into someone else's world, trying to prove he belonged. This was his world, one he built with intention, with courage, with compassion. He cut the ribbon. A cheer erupted, loud and unrestrained, rising like a wave. Children clapped and jumped. Some parents wiped tears. Tanaka bowed. John bowed back. Cameras flashed, but John barely noticed. What mattered were the faces in front of him, faces filled with hunger for opportunity, for knowledge, for a chance. Inside the building, sunlight washed over hallways lined with posters celebrating languages from across the globe. Every room had been designed with care. Open spaces, wooden tables, mats for cultural activities, shelves filled with books donated by universities across the country. On one wall, a mural stretched from floor to ceiling, a bridge painted in deep blues and warm oranges, spanning from a silhouette of a small, modest neighborhood to a skyline of endless possibility. The Bridge Cultural Center offered scholarships, language classes, cultural exchange programs, tutoring, college prep, mentorship, all funded quietly, generously, consistently by the Tanaka Corporation. John had insisted on one rule: no student would ever feel small within these walls. John wasn't a waiter anymore. He wasn't a corporate executive either. He was something better, something truer. He was a director, a teacher, a builder of futures. His fluency, once a secret skill tucked away beneath an apron, had become a tool he used every day teaching Japanese, interpreting documents for immigrant families, helping kids understand that language could be armor or wings or a bridge depending on how they wielded it. It was late one afternoon when he was locking up the center, turning the key with a soft click, the sun dipping toward the horizon. The street was quieter than usual. Only the distant hum of traffic filled the air. He stood for a moment on the top step, letting the warmth of the day settle into his bones. Then he saw her. Across the street, walking slowly, her shoulders slightly hunched, her gaze fixed on her phone as if it were a shield she could hide behind. She wore simple clothes now: jeans, a faded cream sweater, flats worn at the heel. Her blonde hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, strands falling where they wanted. There was no makeup, no designer bag, no entourage. Just a woman waiting at a bus stop. It was Vic. She didn't notice him at first. She scrolled, paused, scrolled again. Her face was tired, not from vanity, but from living. Finally, she lifted her eyes and froze. Their gazes locked across the street. For a moment, time flattened. The city noise seemed to dim, replaced by something heavy and fragile in the space between them. She blinked, her breath catching as though she hadn't expected the moment to find her like this, stripped of armor, stripped of pretense, stripped of everything except raw humanity. She took half a step forward, her lips parted. Not in arrogance, not in fury, but in something that looked frighteningly close to remorse. Maybe she wanted to apologize. Maybe she wanted to justify her past. Or maybe she simply wanted anyone to see her without turning away. But the distance between them felt impossibly wide. John didn't move closer, and he didn't retreat. He simply nodded, once, slow, steady, a gesture that said, "I see you. I acknowledge you, but I do not carry your weight anymore." It was not forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever, but it was peace. The bus arrived with a low hiss, its doors folding open. Vic hesitated before stepping aboard, her eyes lingering on him as though searching for some explanation she might never receive. John watched her sit by the window, her silhouette framed by the fading orange light. For a moment she looked smaller, quieter, like someone beginning again from the ashes of who she used to be. When the bus pulled away, John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned back toward the entrance of the center. Through the glass he could see students gathering inside, laughing, waiting, full of hope. He opened the door and stepped in. He had built a table where everyone was welcome, and that, finally, was the real victory. Thank you for watching this story. If you'd like more narratives like this, emotional, powerful, and transformative, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.